Well, welcome back to our second of our three-part special here on Downforce Racing, and I'm pleased to have alongside me fellow commentator. He's the voice of the iArmy X30 Euro Series and also FIA karting, and also our CEO and founder here at Downforce Racing, Jake Sanson, joins me. Hi, Jake. How are you, buddy?
Hi, Alex. I'm very well indeed, actually, just going through the motions as everybody is with isolation and lock-in, still trying to talk about racing cars going around in circles, as and when they are, of course.
Indeed, and we've got some very, very special points to talk about, especially with Lewis Hamilton recently securing his 7th Formula One world title, equaling the efforts of one Michael Schumacher. So obviously you've got not exactly big shoes to fill, but obviously you follow on from my initial conversation with Matt Bishop, Communications Director at W Series. First question, Jake. What were your emotions when you saw that Lewis had actually done it and had gotten that 7th world title in such a myriad of circumstances? And if I'm honest with you, the Grand Prix itself was a treat to everyone because no one could believe what was unfolding before our very eyes.
Well, it's fascinating that you bring up my emotions because I was actually in the Eurosport commentary box while the race was going on. And I was there with Richard Coleman, the former boss of Bamboo Engineering. And we were obviously in between races and we had a little bit of time. So we thought, well, let's put the Grand Prix on. And we were spellbound by an incredible race. But I think we both kind of looked at each other when Hamilton took the lead and we kind of went, you can't really deny it now, just how impressive he is coming from so far back. I mean, he ended I think at one stage in the race, he was 20 seconds back from the race lead. And then to have that advantage at the finish, it's just extraordinary. I mean, people talk about Lewis being as successful as he is purely because he's in the best racing car. But I think a lot of people have naively forgotten that the driver actually does an incredible amount of development work within a team in order to make that car the best car on the grid. It's not just money thrown at it. I mean, an incredible amount of money was thrown at the Toyota Formula One project many years ago, and that never really went anywhere. And I think just as they were getting into their stride, the company pulled the plug. So you can spend years and years developing a product and throwing all the money in the world you want at it, but it has to be the right people that bring that project forward. And in the same way that Michael Schumacher brought Ferrari forward out of the doldrums, despite the amount of money they were spending, he worked with the team, with the likes of Rory Byrne, with Ross Brawn, with Jean Todt, to bring the project forward. And I think a lot of people forget that Lewis has that ability to develop a project as well, because obviously he was handed an opportunity by McLaren and didn't really do any development driving up until that point. But when he joined the team in 2013 alongside Nico Rosberg, they had a mountain to climb. The car just wasn't there consistently to be a race winner. So they had to do a heck of a lot of work to bring the project forward, to bring it up to a race-winning package. And by mid-season, very similar time frame to what Schumacher did with Ferrari in '96, he had managed to bring it to a winning package. So this is the culmination of an incredible risk and an incredible gamble. Everybody said he was mental to leave McLaren and join Mercedes at the time. And I think, those people are eating their words now in what they've created. They've created a winning team and a winning combination. But a lot of people are completely forgetting the fact that Lewis is at the center of that. He's done a heck of a lot of the hard work and he enjoys all of the plaudits from the team and deserves a lot more respect than the media can ever give him.
I think I was one of those people that was actually very much in favour of Lewis's decision, as I explained to Matt in our first part. I was interviewed on GP Focus. A good friend, Ewan Marshall, actually asked me the question, Alex, what do you personally think of Lewis moving from McLaren to Mercedes? And I went, well, as long as he gets the right team around him, that car could be something special. And I think if I'd have put money on that he would have won his 7th world title, I think I would have been comfortably well off by now. But I think one of the biggest things that also was a bit of a talking point. There's two actually I want to bring up here, Jake. The first one, the respect and the sheer admiration that Sebastian Vettel showed by shaking Lewis by the hand whilst Lewis was still trying to gather up his thoughts to get out of the car and start celebrating not only the victory, but the 7th world title. It was very, very much a seminal moment because everyone had thought that Sebastian would have been the driver that would have equaled and maybe even surpassed Michael. But no, it was Lewis, who is still at 35 years of age. He is at the peak of his powers, and I won't be at all surprised if he gets another contract very shortly after the season's conclusion in 2020 to stay with Mercedes. I think maybe until he turns 38. Another 3-year contract.
It's quite
possibly.
possible, yeah. It was nice to see that from Vettel. You know, it was a classy moment from a class act. And I have been very vocal in the past about how little respect I have had for Sebastian Vettel's personality in the past. But what we've seen from him as he has grown with Ferrari is that he's actually become a very well-rounded, very classy guy, but very similar, in fact, to Michael Schumacher, because they have many moments where they're very comparable. So essentially, a lot of people had issues with some of the maneuvers that Michael did on track. You've got to look at Adelaide 94, Jerez 97, Monaco 2006, just as a couple of the moments. And Vettel has had those moments too. You know, he's had very similar, like you've got to look back at Baku when he banged wheels with Hamilton under a safety car. There are little moments like that. And Vettel has had very similar moments and problems in his career. 2010, Istanbul is another good one, and Malaysia 2013, you know, where he's basically decided to take, you know, his own line and his own tack. So there are a lot of comparisons between the two, but interestingly, I think Vettel is as classy a driver off the circuit as Schumacher always was. You could never fault Michael Schumacher off a race circuit. He was an incredible ambassador for motor racing, an incredibly well-rounded individual, brought fitness to an unbelievable level, which is now the standard, of course, in Formula One. That's now just what every Formula One driver does. But Schumacher started that trend. And Vettel is actually very similar to Schumacher in the way that he carries himself now off the circuit. I've actually won a lot of respect for Vettel over the last 3 seasons or so. He may not have had the results go his way and he may have lost a title or two, but essentially what he's been able to do is prove that you don't just have to be a world champion to be a hero. And he has really been able to demonstrate many times in the last few seasons that it's how you carry yourself as a personality in the sport that matters. And Vettel has really changed a lot of people's minds in terms of his thinking. So it was very indicative of the kind of man he is now, to be able to walk up to Lewis and, you know, say, we've just watched history being made. And that would have been difficult for him because, you know, through his Red Bull years where he was dominating season after season after season, winning 4 straight titles, it would have been very easy for him to start to think, you know, maybe it's my turn. Maybe I could go on and emulate Schumacher. Maybe I could go and beat his records. And it just hasn't played out that way since joining Ferrari. Ferrari now is very different to when Michael Schumacher was there. And the inter-team politics have not made it very easy for Sebastian to pick up the torch and run with it. So he's not been able to enjoy the same success, but he still has, you know, a deep understanding and respect for great talent and great sporting credence. And I think that's why Vettel and Hamilton, despite the fact that there's been that rivalry, they do in essence actually get on. You know, they do respect each other and they do actually have, you know, that spirit of competition that is supposed to be there in Formula One. And I think it's because the two of them recognize, you know, they're racing against someone who genuinely is at the pinnacle of their game, and they've really had to pull the stops out. But what it proves ultimately is just how strong Lewis is in the amount of times he's been able to come out in front of Vettel, who is as good, if not better at times, in being able to bring the package together. So it really does show just how classy Lewis has been able to be in the last few years.
I think also there's a point that I didn't actually cover with Matt, but this is going to sort of segue into what we're going to talk about on this particular part of the 3-part series. The tyres were absolutely decimated. They were nigh on slicks for about 75% of the Pirelli rubber that were on there. And it harked me back to 2007 when they were at Shanghai, and the wrong call got made, and the way that Lewis was just sort of like absolutely metronomic. You know, he was making sure that car got to the end, irrespective of how much rubber was still on the carcass at the end of it, it seemed like people were changing tyres left, right, and centre. Lance Stroll lost the lead, having put it on, his first ever pole position in Formula One, which no one could have seen coming. The first ever driver since Jacques Villeneuve to actually do so, and that was back in '97 that JV actually secured his pole position. So a great day for Canada on Saturday. But just how much that echoes karting in a lot of respects, because a lot of these drivers that we see in Formula One nowadays have come through karting. Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc were at each other's throats back in KZ back in the day. 2013, 2012. Lewis, in his own right, used to race all across the globe with Nico Rosberg when they were back in karting as teammates, and the teammate dynamic was very different when they became teammates in 2013 at Mercedes. But you have to say that karting was very, very much, Lewis knew that was a skill that he could call on and really used to his distinct advantage at Istanbul.
Oh, absolutely. And it's very interesting that the top three drivers in the Turkish Grand Prix are three drivers who are noted for being very, very good on tyres. Hamilton, Perez, Vettel. It's one of the very interesting dynamics of modern Formula One. Perez has always been the master of tyre strategy within the midfield, and it's no surprise to me that he was second position in those circumstances. Hamilton and Vettel have always been very good at looking after tyres as well. So again, very interesting to see them on the podium. But yes, this is a skill that goes a long, long way back. And, Lewis learned a valuable lesson in 2007 Shanghai that you mentioned. And it's that, you can override the team strategy from time to time and come out with a better plan, which he did at Istanbul. He overrode them in terms of making a decision to make a pit stop. They said, we're going to come in. And he said, no, the tyres feel fine. And he was right. And it was able to bring him to the victory. So he learned a valuable lesson when he lost the 2007 crown, that, you don't just have to blindly obey. You can actually use your own judgment. And Lewis has been using his own judgment since he was 9 years old, since he was one of the starlets of cadet racing in British karting up against the likes of Nicky Richardson and Alex Lloyd. And it's fabulous that someone from the depths of British club karting has been able to rise their way through the various regional, national, and then international degrees of karting to get up to that point. What it does is it essentially gives hope to those people who genuinely see it as, an unattainable goal. It is genuinely doable. It is genuinely possible. The difficulty now is it takes an obscene amount of money, an obscene amount of luck. You have to be, in the right place at the right time. But relying on your raw talent is obviously an incredibly important part of that. And Lewis was able to demonstrate that very quickly. I don't think he really got into the British public consciousness of what he was really able to do until he signed the deal with McLaren in early 1998 to support him through the ladder. But what he was able to demonstrate in a series that was pretty much created by McLaren Mercedes in order to showcase Lewis's talents, essentially was the Champions of the Future, which started in 97, I think. And that made its way onto television screens at a time when motor racing was limited, to 5 channels in Great Britain, essentially, for those who, Sky was still a luxury in those days. So for the main audience to have a 1 hour, half-hour karting show a few times a year was big news for karting in those days, because it was terrestrial television and people could see the likes of Lewis Hamilton, Paul di Resta, a couple of other names from the grid at that time, Martin Plowman, who's gone on to Le Mans 24-hour racing success and IndyCar success. These guys were literally like boyhood karters going in there and trying to showcase their talents to the world. And what stood out for me, for Lewis, was essentially his incredible professionalist attitude from a very young age. He seemed to be very focused very early on, very determined. And I think at a karting level, he was probably one of those drivers who was a bit serious. One of the great things about karting at that level is that it's meant to be fun. And a lot of drivers have taken that on board and embraced it. There are some, though, that you see who, for them, it literally is their office. It's their workplace. And for Lewis, it was always very much, this is work. I've got to make sure, if I'm going to get to Formula One, this is going to be, this is my office. This is my concentration levels. And what always really stunned me from that 1998 season, which I still have on VHS up there, was just his level of superiority over everybody else because of the way that the points system worked in the Champions of the Future. He didn't win the title in 1998 in Junior Intercontinental. He actually lost out to Fraser Sheeder by a handful of points, but his performances in finals in particularly were just exceptional. I mean, the first final of the year, Lark Hall, 1998, the conditions were wetter than anything I've ever seen in any form of motor racing anywhere ever. How they didn't stop the race is just unbelievable to me. But he just disappeared out into the lead, and his ability to extend the gap in a sport that should be won by tenths, not masses and masses of seconds, was just extraordinary. And I think it was then that we really knew, okay, we've got something pretty special here. And Lewis has been able to do that in every formula that he's ever taken on. And it's been astonishing to watch him come through from that level of karting to produce that every weekend. But he's always had it. You know, he's had it since the early days of karting. And I think people who haven't seen his karting days in detail find it really difficult to accept just how strong and how superior he is in Formula One nowadays. Because the thing is, it was always like that. In karting, he was able to find that extra special something to stretch that far ahead of the rest of the field. So in Formula One, for people who have seen him in karting, it's not actually that big a shock that he's been so strong as he has been, how he's been able to build Mercedes around him, how he's been able to get these incredible victories. Because in karting, we knew it was there all along.
Yeah, I think, I mean, out of the grid, I know of at least 3 to 4 drivers that have been a part of the Super One paddock. Of course, John Hoyle has seen some of these talents come through, Lewis being one of them, George Russell, Lando Norris, and Alexander Albon. I think are the 4 drivers that I think you're nodding in agreement there with me, Jakey boy, aren't you? That
yes,
those
indeed.
4.
In fact, it's funny you mentioned George Russell. The first ever television interview I did for Super One back in 2012 was with George Russell. So it goes back a heck of a long way.
It's quite funny how that there are these ever repeating circles. But, you know, let's have a look at Lewis's career in karting. You know, we saw that he went through Intercontinental A, went to Formula A in 2000, and then Formula Super A the year after. You know, he's racing with Team MBM with Nico at that particular moment in time. And that's where you saw the real rivalry between those two sort of take off to another level, because, you know, they were really, really good friends. They were racing over as far overseas as Japan, so over in circuits like probably Gotemba, Auto Paradise and the like. You could really see that there was a possibility that with those 2 drivers being teammates, okay, they were all chummy. They had a lot of laughs off. You know, we've seen like old photos of Nico and Lewis when they were larking around in the paddock and karting. But then when they joined as teammates at 2013, Nico was already established with the team because he'd been with Michael, you know, since 2010. Michael had decided to hang up his helmet for good for the second time. And then Lewis came in. And you could see that there was a different ambience, a different atmosphere in the you know, in what was effectively 12 years between them last competing against one another. And then we saw in 2016 at Barcelona, where that rivalry came to, I think, the biggest explosion, I think, of between teammates since Senna and Prost in '88. At the Casio Triangle at Suzuka. Within the first lap, they had literally, it was like neither of them was going to get a quarter. It was like the old elbows out karting days, wasn't it? And then along comes Max Verstappen in his first race for Red Bull, and he becomes the youngest ever Grand Prix winner. No one could have predicted that one, could they?
No, indeed. It's funny you talk about Nico Rosberg. I've actually got a bit of a theory about Nico Rosberg in that on track, certainly not off track, but on track, Nico Rosberg was very similar to James Hunt in the sense that in the same way that Niki Lauda was James Hunt's reason to keep pushing, you know, James needed Niki to drag the best out of himself. I think Nico Rosberg over the years needed Lewis Hamilton to drag the best out of himself. If they had never been teammates in the best car, I'm not sure Nico would have got the chance to really fight for the world championship and bring himself to the fore. But the fact that they were teammates and they knew each other right the way back from karting and they knew each other's tricks, I think it raised Nico Rosberg's game. I think we saw the very best we were ever going to see from Nico, knowing that the man he had to beat was the man he'd grown up sharing, flats with, sharing a race team with, sharing racing apexes with when they were in karting. He knew Lewis's tricks. So he had to bring the best out of himself in order to win the world title. And the only way to do that was to beat Lewis. And Nico is actually a very incredible talent in and of his own right, but only when genuinely being pushed by Lewis. And it's interesting because he had that need to beat Lewis all the time. And that was when you got to see the two of them absolute masters of their craft. Lewis never switches it off. And I think that's the difference between the two of them. Nico had moments where he couldn't quite get the best out of himself. He needed that little bit of an extra motivation, that little bit of fire in his belly. And Lewis was the man who was really the catalyst for it. But even in their karting days, you could always see that while the two of them were very impressive on track, Lewis always just had a tiny bit of an edge over Nico. And it was minimal. We're talking like hundredths of a second over a lap sometimes. But just what Lewis was able to demonstrate throughout that 2000 season that you mentioned in particular, 2000 was really the year the world got to know what Lewis was capable of. And his performance in the World Cup in particular out in Suzuka, I still get chills having seen it back then at the time. And, I watch it again and he's racing up against guys that were a good 5, 6, 7 years older than him, as well as people like Nico, and was still able to stand up and do a fantastic job. Even watching the Paris-Bercy at the end of 2000, when he's going up against drivers twice his age and being able to just run rings around them. That's not just a weight discrepancy. That's pure talent. You've got to be able to hack it with people who are twice your age and be able to be strong mentally and strong physically. And he just had it down pat right from the start. He was 15 in that 2000 season. And he just looked like an absolute world-class driver wherever he went. And it was very hard for Colin Brown to beat him in the World Championship, but beat him he did. And again, it was because he had to drag the best out of himself to beat Lewis Hamilton. And this is what drivers do and have done since the late 90s. They have known, in the same way that racing drivers in the 50s and 60s would look at the lap times and go, okay, what's Sterling Moss doing? They would always say, where's Moss? Because that's the guy you've got to beat. It's always been that way with people who are going up against Hamilton. They knew that Hamilton is the guy they've got to beat. And it's been fascinating because he's just had that all the way through. But how he transcended from karting to cars was actually very interesting because he didn't set the world on fire straight away. He really had to dig deep and find something. And it was very clever of Ron Dennis to essentially suggest to him, okay, we're going to do 2 years in this category. We're not going to go out and win it in the first year. We're going to do 2 years in this category. So the first year was kind of conservative in the approach, just learning the grade. And by year 2, he would be astonishing. And it was the same in Formula Renault. It was the same in Formula 3, which makes his GP2 series win in 2006 so impressive because he had just 1 year essentially to prove himself. He knew that there was going to be this vacancy at McLaren with Montoya gone. So he knew that there was a chance for him to get in there and prove to Ron Dennis, I can do this, I can hack this. So he really had to accelerate his own development. And what he was able to demonstrate in GP2 that year at Silverstone, at Istanbul in particular, he showcased that he was ready and he had the ability to come straight in. So a lot of people, from an armchair point of view, would have looked at Hamilton coming in his rookie season and seen it as sensational. But no, he was just proving that with the right equipment, he had what it took to be as equal as Alonso, as equal as Raikkonen, as equal as Massa. But because it happened so quickly, I don't think people were prepared for just how impressive he was. But it was exactly the same when Schumacher came in. When Schumacher came in 91 and went straight into the Jordan and put it 7th on the grid at Spa, I think people were taken aback very quickly because it's like, well, how has this guy been able to put a Jordan in their first season in Formula One up in P7? Nobody was really ready for it. So it was no surprise that Briatore was going to steal him away and bring him to Benetton. And I don't think he finished outside the points then until Kyalami the next year when he got taken out by Senna. That's an incredible demonstration of the raw talent of a driver. And there's only a handful of those that have ever come through Formula One in such a manner. I think Senna's in that group. I think Schumacher's in that group. I think Kubica is in that group, but he was never really given the chance to develop it, unfortunately, before his injuries. But he was of that same caliber. And Lewis always used to say, you know, Kubica is one of the greatest drivers in the world. So he could have been something pretty special. Beloff is in that category. Early Alesi was in that category. Unfortunately, he joined forces with Ferrari and got into bad habits at the wrong moment in his career. But Lewis was just that natural ability. I think people knock him because he's too dominant or he's too complaining. You know, he whinges too much about what's going on in the car. Nigel Mansell used to do the same thing, exactly the same thing. In fact, people used to call him the whinge. You know, he was just a big whinge. But do you know what? He was successful. He won races. He won a world championship. He completely revolutionized what Renault and Elf did together to get the best out of the engine. And without him complaining about it, it would never have happened. So it's funny how people are, you know, sort of tainting Lewis in terms of his ability and talent. For people who are in the know, they know they're witnessing the greatest ever.
I think also another driver that used to moan about not having any grip, Jenson Button. So the thing is that because of the drivers wanting to be the absolute optimum, car-wise, but also setup-wise, is a very, very intrinsic thing. I mean, there's a quote that relates to Michael talking about Lewis, and this was back in 2001. He said, he's a quality driver, very strong, and only 16. If he keeps this up, I'm sure he will reach Formula One. It's something special to see a kid of his age out on the circuit. He's clearly got the right racing mentality. That was back in 2001. And then in 2020, when Lewis officially, I think it was matched Michael's record of 91 race victories, that his son Mick presented Lewis with the last ever race helmet that Michael used in his final season in Formula One, the Red Baron helmet, very much akin to the late Niki Lauda. Yeah. And that was just another sign that I'm sure that Michael was watching at that particular point. I think there is a distinct feeling that he would have been seeing what Lewis was achieving year after year. And now that after 264 starts, he's had every single one powered by Mercedes through his McLaren and Mercedes tenure. You know, he's got, 94 race victories now, over 160 podiums. He's scored over 3,600 points. And the win ratio that he's had at the moment, I think, equals around about 35% of his total race starts. I mean, when you look at, the statistics, Jake, only tell one side of the story. And I think it's just it's the start of things to come. As our good friend Dre Harrison said, he's only getting started. And we have to give Dre a special mention because I read an article on Motorsport 101 that Dre had written, and he said he's only, it's like he's only just getting started. I read the whole article from start to finish. And for those wondering about it, I'm going to post the link to that article down in the description below. But it just shows that how, despite every roadblock that has been thrown his way, through being bullied as a youngster, taking up martial arts, through everything that is going on with the, and this was something I talked with Matt about, how welcoming not just Lewis has been, but everyone in Formula One, about W Series being part of the paddock, like Kevin Magnussen, Romain Grosjean, Esteban Ocon, Daniel Ricciardo, everyone commented on it, like literally that weekend, of how great it was to have another feeder series in that is actually going to help provide an example for more young girls, young women and women to get into motorsport, not from a driver perspective, but also from engineering, IT. We've got people like Ruth Buncombe in this with Alfa Romeo. She's their strategy engineer. I've met Ruth, lovely lady. You've got people like Tabitha Valls, who does a lot of work with behind the scenes. She used to do press for when it was Toro Rosso. And she worked with Danny Juncadella, who also was a test driver for Force India at that point in 2014. So there's a lot of hardworking women behind the scenes in Formula One that we don't really hear of. And to hear Lewis's comments was something so refreshing, but also not just from him, but from all the other drivers. And then also there's the inclusivity standpoint, you know, with what Lewis is doing as an activist, and trying to put the word out. And again, we have to go back to Sebastian. Sebastian has been kneeling by Lewis's side. And that is the biggest sense of solidarity between two rivals who are good friends off the track and respect each other deeply. I mean, it just goes to show that Lewis is only getting started. And I can't wait to see how much more he goes to put that new level up for, I think, records that will stand for a very, very long time to come.
I completely agree. Yeah, it's fantastic. And do you know, he's taken a heck of a lot of stick this year, Lewis, for bringing politics into the sport. I commend him. I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with him. And if I could stand with him, I would. And I think people are too shallow in the sense that they genuinely believe that politics and sport, you know, should never mix. But unfortunately, those same people are the ones who deliberately refuse to watch the politics. You know, they're only interested in the sport. They don't get those messages through to them, and therefore they'll never see that message. So if it's got to the stage where change can only happen if someone in the sporting world gets that message out there through their sport, then I say good on you. You know, there are limits to what you can stand until it gets ridiculous. If people are unwilling to go and seek that message in a wider medium, then you have to bring that message to where their people will see it. And I completely and wholeheartedly agree with him. Obviously, within the sport and within wider sport in general, there's work to be done. You know, we're nowhere near finished yet. And I think Lewis has actually challenged the establishments, not just in motorsport, but sport in general. You know, when he walked onto the podium at Mugello, wearing the T-shirt, you know, arrest the cops that killed Breonna Taylor. No one would ever have brought that conversation up in Formula One had he not started it. But it is an important one. It's a very important topic, and it can't just be swept under the carpet. And I think people are naive and deliberately obtuse in thinking that these arguments are not relevant, they're not important. Well, yes, it is, because although it's politics that they're talking, not sport, both are human endeavors, and it's a human issue. Therefore, you can't just be blind to it. You can't be short-sighted enough to accept that that message isn't for you. It is for you. It's for everyone. And it's the same with, you know, equality within the sport. We're now going to get to see W Series on the Formula One bill. And yes, the argument about segregation is there, but I do think that W Series is relevant to be on the Formula One paddock, because you still have to be able to demonstrate to people that women can be racing drivers at that level and on that platform. And to give them that platform alongside Formula One is an incredible opportunity to showcase that. But it does kind of show at the same time that segregation needed to happen in that particular championship to showcase the message. And it's difficult because I do accept, you know, that segregation is not the way to make, you know, women equal to men within motorsport. But at the same time, you do have to create that sort of platform to get the message out there, to show people that, you know, women can be racing drivers at the top level. The very fact that it's going to be on the Formula One bill is a massive game changer. The fact that that series carries super license points that they can take on to Formula 3 and into Formula 2, that's a big standing point. But it has to have that initial first step. You have to take that first plunge to showcase the equality. And I think it's an incredible performance. And, you know, full credit to Matt and to Caroline and everybody who have done an absolutely fantastic job with W Series. They really have put in a spectacular performance in 2019. I missed it a lot in 2020. And I can't wait to see what it will come out with next year. But it is fascinating. You know, the sport still has little things that it needs to do. And Lewis is fighting a battle that he's determined to win in terms of the equality and the way that, you know, race is portrayed within sport. And I really commend him for it. But the thing is, people are knocking him back. And that's the biggest challenge he's got at the moment. You know, people are going to try and rip him apart for doing it. And I think he just needs to stay strong. He needs to stay true to himself. He's been very clever. You know, he's waited until he's in a position of authority where he's on the brink of becoming the greatest of all time to start making that moment happen. And I think he was fortunate in the way that the movement started, that he was able to get on board with it at the right time when he could be a voice of authority and a voice of wisdom within it. Now, he's not perfect. You know, he does race in a sport where there's pollution. He does race in a sport where there are difficulties. We're going to Saudi Arabia next year. Vitaly Petrov was made a driver steward and made some very inappropriate comments that really made FOM at the time look like they had egg on their faces, but it wasn't, you know, relevant to his appointment. There are still things that need to be done, but Lewis is there fighting the good fight and doing what he needs to do to make those feelings felt. Now, anybody that has a problem with that genuinely needs to consider why they've got a problem with it. Because at the end of the day, it's a human issue. He is fighting for the equality of humanity, not just for black people, for anybody within the sport. You know, his message transcends black races in the sport. It's also gay and homosexual and transgender people within the sport. It's women within the sport. It's people with disability within the sport. You know, his message is a universal one, and it's one that can't be quashed by people in a boardroom with pieces of paper and signatures on. It's a very, very important message, and he needs to be allowed to express it. And unfortunately, the people who have seen this as a very inappropriate method of going about it have kind of lost the point of the message. I'm right behind Lewis. I think he's doing an absolutely exceptional thing in a volatile time where social media scrutiny is at its highest it's ever been. I mean, in the days of Mansell and Senna and Piquet, I'm sure there were a lot of keyboard warrior opinions that could have come out in the wash about, you know, their decision making, about how evil Senna might have been when he went after Prost at Suzuka 1990. All sorts of opinions could have come out in the wash. Damon Hill would have been highly scrutinized for the way he'd gone about things at Williams. Schumacher, I think, would have had a lot more criticism if social media channels like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram had been there in the day. Lewis happens to be a product of his time, but he's fighting the challenges of the product of his time, and he's doing it with grace, and he's doing it with strength. And I think, you know, the only way to make that a successful battle is for people to understand what he's doing and why he's doing it, rather than just outright attacking him. Yes, he's a racing driver. Yes, he's in a sport, but he still has an important message to share with the world, and he should be sharing it if people aren't going out of their way to find out the relevance and importance of that message. I think he should be doing it, and I want him to wear more t-shirts that have Nigerian flags on them. I want him to wear more messages of support for people in hardship. I think he should be doing more, and he's doing everything that he possibly can. It's great to see, and people knocking him down have clearly lost the point and the purpose of why he's doing it.
We might not race as one, as Formula One clearly says on their hashtag with the rainbow on it, but there is one person who always declares, especially with a tattoo on the top of his shoulders, still I rise. So, I mean, Jake, thank you very much for your welcome insight. I completely wholeheartedly agree that we need to look past the shallow-minded thoughts of individuals that have these issues with everything that's going on. I, for one, am completely with Lewis on what he is saying, what he is doing. And I think now is the next chapter. He is a global superstar. The US can't get enough of him at the minute. And I'd like to thank you very much for your time, as always, my good friend.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm very glad to be involved in it. And hopefully we'll continue to see what Lewis can do. I would love him to shatter 100 wins. I'd love to see him get an 8th title next year. And hopefully we'll get to see it.
Indeed, we will. Thank you very much, Jake.